$5, the billionaire said, sliding the bill across the polished mahogany table. That's what your service is worth. And just like that, the air inside the restaurant shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet, uncomfortable way when something true is said out loud. The kind of truth people pretend not to hear. Crystal glasses still clinked, low jazz still hummed through hidden speakers. But the moment had already cracked open, and everyone at that table felt it, even if they didn't look up, especially her. Naomi Carter stood there in her pressed black uniform, tray balanced steady in her hand, posture straight, eyes calm. The kind of calm that didn't come from peace but from practice, because this wasn't new. Not really. Not the tone, not the smirk, not the way powerful men tested the world like it belonged to them. Like people were just reflections of what they could gain. Richard Holloway leaned back in his chair, expensive suit, silver at his temples. The kind of presence that filled a room without asking. A man who had built an empire from nothing and believed that gave him the right to measure everything, including her. It's a test, he added casually, glancing at the others at the table as if inviting them into the experiment. I like to see how people respond when they think no one important is watching. A few quiet chuckles followed. The kind that didn't come from humor but from alignment, because no one at that table wanted to be on the wrong side of a man like him. Naomi didn't move right away. She placed the check gently beside the bill, her fingers steady, no shake, no hesitation, and for a brief second, her eyes met his, not challenging, not submissive, just present. And that was the first thing he didn't expect, because most people either pushed back or shrank, but she did neither. She simply saw him, and something about that made the moment stretch longer than it should have, longer than anyone at the table was comfortable with. Outside, the city moved like it always did, cars passing, lights blinking, lives unfolding. But inside that room, time held its breath, because this was never really about $5. It was about what people revealed when they believed the stakes were small, when kindness felt optional, when respect had no immediate return. And Naomi knew that kind of moment well. She had lived in it, grown through it, learned how to stand inside it without letting it define her. She had seen people confuse silence with weakness, and she had learned that sometimes silence was the strongest answer, until it wasn't, until the right moment arrived, and something shifted, something deeper than words, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with who someone chose to be when they thought it didn't matter. Naomi turned away from the table with the same measured grace she had used all night, her steps quiet against the polished floor, but inside, something old and familiar stirred, not anger, not even hurt, but recognition, because she had seen this before, not in this exact room, not with this exact man, but in the countless moments where people decided her value before she ever spoke. And she had learned early that reacting too quickly only gave them the ending they expected, so instead she moved through the restaurant like nothing had changed, refilling glasses, clearing plates, offering polite nods. But her mind was steady, focused, almost detached, as if she were watching the moment from a distance, studying it, understanding it, because moments like this were never about the tip. They were about power, about who believed they had it and who was expected to accept it. Behind her, the table continued. Conversations picked back up, laughter returned in fragments, but something was off, something subtle had shifted. Richard Holloway noticed it too, though he could not name it. He watched her as she moved across the room, efficient, composed, unaffected in a way that did not fit the outcome he had anticipated, because usually there was a reaction, a flicker of irritation, a forced smile, something that confirmed his assumption, but Naomi gave him nothing, and that absence began to feel louder than any protest. He adjusted slightly in his seat, his fingers tapping once against the edge of the table, a habit he had when something did not resolve cleanly in his mind. Interesting, he murmured under his breath, not to anyone in particular, just enough to hear his own thought, because for a man who built his life on reading people, predicting them, categorizing them within seconds, she did not fit, and that unsettled him more than he expected. Across the room, Naomi paused near the service station, setting down an empty tray, her reflection catching briefly in the mirrored wall, and for a moment, she allowed herself a breath, a single quiet inhale, grounding, not to gather strength, but to choose intention, because she knew she still had a decision to make. She could leave the moment as it was, another quiet story of being underestimated, or she could say something, not to prove anything, not to win, but to place a truth in the room that would not disappear once spoken. And that was the difference. She was not thinking about him. Not really. She was thinking about the kind of person she wanted to be in moments like this, because dignity was not something given. It was something carried, and sometimes it needed a voice. She turned back toward the table, not quickly, not dramatically, just with purpose, each step measured, each movement deliberate. And when she reached his side again, the conversation slowed without anyone asking it to, as if the room itself recognized that something unfinished was about to be completed. Richard looked up, meeting her gaze once more, this time not with amusement, not with certainty, but with curiosity, because whatever he had expected from this moment, it was no longer that. And for the first time that night, he was not the one in control of what came next. Naomi stopped beside the table, not rushing, not hesitating, just arriving in the moment like she had been there all along. And for a brief second, no one spoke, because something in her presence shifted the balance in a way that no one could quite explain. She did not raise her voice, she did not force attention, but somehow, she had it, completely. Richard looked at her, studying now, not measuring, not calculating, just watching, and that alone was new. "Is there something else you would like to say?" he asked, his tone controlled, but no longer certain. And Naomi held his gaze, steady, calm, her voice soft but clear enough to cut through the room without effort. "Yes, sir," she said, placing the $5 bill gently back on the table, not as rejection, not as defiance, but as something more precise, something intentional. "You said this was a test," she continued, her words measured, each one landing exactly where it needed to. "But tests do not reveal the worth of the person being tested, they reveal the character of the one giving them." The sentence settled into the space between them, quiet, undeniable, and for a moment, it felt as if the entire restaurant leaned in without moving. Because this was not confrontation, this was clarity, the kind that does not need force to be felt. Richard did not respond immediately, not because he chose silence, but because for the first time that night, he did not have a ready answer. His mind moved through its usual patterns, searching for control, for framing, for a way to place this moment back into something familiar. But it did not fit. Her words did not attack him. They did not accuse him. They simply reflected him. And that was harder to dismiss. Around the table, the others shifted slightly. Some looked down, some glanced at each other, unsure whether to react. Because the dynamic they had been comfortable in just minutes ago no longer existed in the same way. Naomi did not wait for a reply. She did not need one. She had not come back for approval. And that was the difference. She had come back to leave something behind, something that would stay long after she walked away. And with that, she gave a small, professional nod, the same one she gave every guest, and turned to leave, her steps as steady as before, no faster, no slower. But now the silence followed her, not because she demanded it, but because she had changed something in the room that no one could easily undo. Richard watched her go, his expression unreadable, but inside, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in that quiet, unsettling way when a belief begins to loosen its grip. Because for years, he had believed that people revealed themselves under pressure, that value could be measured through controlled moments, through tests designed by those who understood the game. But now, for the first time, he questioned whether he had been reading the wrong signal all along, whether the test had never been about them, but about him. And that thought, simple as it was, did not leave when she walked away. It stayed, echoing in a place he could not ignore. The rest of the dinner continued, but not in the same way. Conversations resumed in fragments, forced at first, like actors returning to a script that no longer fit. Forks touched plates, glasses lifted, but the rhythm was off, and everyone at the table felt it, even if no one said it out loud, because something had been exposed that could not be unseen. Richard Holloway sat back in his chair, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, but his attention was no longer on the people speaking around him. It followed her, not physically, but mentally, replaying the moment in precise detail, her tone, her posture, the absence of anger, the clarity of her words, it did not match any pattern he had built his life around. And that was the problem, because Richard was a man who trusted patterns, who believed that if you observed enough, tested enough, you could predict anyone, reduce them to a set of responses, control the outcome before it even began. That belief had made him powerful. It had built his empire. But now, sitting in that chair, surrounded by wealth and influence, he felt something unfamiliar, not threatened, not embarrassed, but unsettled, because for the first time, the equation did not resolve. One of the men across from him attempted a joke, something about market volatility. Light laughter followed, but it faded quickly, because even they could feel that Richard was no longer fully present. His fingers rested against the edge of the table, still now, no tapping, no movement, just stillness, as if he were holding on to something that might slip away if he let go. Across the room, Naomi continued her work, moving from table to table with the same steady rhythm. No change in pace, no glance back, as if the moment had already passed for her, as if it had never been about staying in it, but about placing something there and leaving it behind. And that contrast, her ability to move on while he remained caught in it, deepened the silence inside him. Because Richard Holloway was not used to being left with unanswered thoughts, he was used to closing loops, finishing conversations, defining outcomes. But this was different. This lingered, and without realizing it, he began to look beyond the moment, beyond the restaurant, beyond the controlled environments where he usually operated, and something older surfaced, a memory he had not revisited in years, a small diner off a highway, decades ago, before the suits, before the boardrooms, before the name carried weight. He had been younger then, unknown, uncertain, sitting alone with more ambition than resources. And there had been a waitress. He could not remember her name, but he remembered the way she treated him, not as a future success, not as a transaction, but simply as a person. She had refilled his coffee without asking, offered a quiet word of encouragement when she saw the papers spread across his table, and when he left, he had barely been able to afford a proper tip, yet she had smiled the same, unchanged, and at the time, he had told himself he would never forget that feeling, that sense of being seen when there was nothing to gain from seeing him. But somewhere along the way, he had replaced that memory with systems, with tests, with a belief that value had to be proven under pressure, and now, sitting in that restaurant, he realized something that did not sit comfortably. He had become the opposite of the moment that once defined him, and that realization did not come with noise or drama. It arrived quietly, settling into him with a weight that could not be dismissed, because it was not about her anymore. It was about him, and whether he was willing to face what had just been revealed. Richard did not remember finishing his meal. The plates were cleared, the conversations ended, the signatures on contracts exchanged with the usual precision, but his mind remained somewhere else, replaying a single sentence that refused to dissolve. And when he finally stood, adjusting his jacket, offering the same firm handshakes he had perfected over decades, there was a subtle delay in his movements, a fraction of hesitation that no one else would notice. But he felt it, because for the first time in years, he was not entirely certain of the version of himself he was presenting. Outside, the night air was cool, sharp against the warmth of the restaurant. The city lights stretched endlessly, reflecting off glass towers that symbolized everything he had built, everything he controlled. Yet none of it felt as solid in that moment as it had just hours before. His driver stepped forward, opening the door, but Richard paused before getting in, his eyes drifting back toward the entrance, not expecting to see her, not even sure why he was looking. And of course, she was not there. She had already moved on, her shift continuing, her night unfolding without him. And that realization carried a weight he could not immediately explain, because he was used to being the center of every interaction, the defining force in every room. But this time, he had been left behind in a moment that no longer belonged to him. He sat in the back seat, the door closing with a quiet finality, and as the car pulled into the flow of traffic, the city passing in blurred reflections of light and motion, he allowed the silence to remain. No calls, no instructions, no distractions, just thought. Something he usually avoided unless it served a purpose. But this demanded attention, because it was not about strategy or outcome. It was about alignment. about whether the man he had become still matched the values he once believed in. The memory from earlier did not fade. It sharpened. The small diner, the unknown waitress, the quiet kindness that had asked for nothing in return, and the realization settled deeper now, not as a passing thought, but as a question that would not leave. When had he decided that people needed to be tested to be valued? When had respect become conditional? And more importantly, what had that cost him over the years, not financially, not materially, but in something far less visible and far more permanent? He reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, not searching for a business contact, not reviewing numbers or reports, but something else, something unfamiliar. After a moment, he opened a contact he rarely used, his attorney, the man who handled everything that mattered when it came to legacy, inheritance, decisions that extended beyond his lifetime. His thumb paused again, not from uncertainty, but from recognition, because this was not a small action. This was not a reaction to a moment. This was a response to a truth he could no longer ignore, and without overthinking it, without framing it into strategy, he pressed call. The line rang once, twice, and when the voice answered on the other end, Richard did not begin with explanation. He did not justify or elaborate. He simply said, "We need to make a change." And for the first time in a long time, the words were not about gaining more. They were about becoming something he had almost forgotten how to be. The line stayed quiet after he spoke, but his attorney did not rush to respond, because men like Richard Holloway did not make calls like this without reason, and the silence on the other end was not confusion. It was attention, the kind that waits for something important to follow. But Richard did not explain right away. He looked out the window as the city lights slid past in long reflections, thinking not about numbers or percentages, but about a single moment that had shifted something he could not ignore. "I want to revise my will," he said finally, his voice steady, but different, less mechanical, more deliberate. "Not adjust it, not update it, rewrite it." There was a pause. Then his attorney spoke carefully. "That is a significant change, Richard. May I ask what prompted this?" And for a second, Richard almost gave the answer he would have given before, something controlled, something strategic. But he stopped himself, because this time, the truth mattered more than the framing. "I realized something tonight," he said. "I have spent years deciding who deserves what, measuring people, testing them, believing that is how value is proven, but I was wrong." The words felt unfamiliar, not because they were difficult, but because they were honest in a way he had avoided. The attorney did not interrupt. He simply listened, and Richard continued. "I built everything I have on the idea that people show who they are under pressure, but I forgot that I show who I am in the way I treat people when there is nothing to gain." The car slowed at a light, a soft red glow filling the interior for a brief moment, and Richard closed his eyes, not out of exhaustion, but clarity. "I want part of what I have built to go towards something different, something that does not reward power, but recognizes dignity." On the other end, the attorney shifted slightly, processing, recalculating, but still cautious. "And who would oversee something like that?" he asked, because this was where decisions like this usually returned to control, to familiar structures, to people within Richard's circle, but Richard did not hesitate this time. "Her," he said simply, and for a moment, even the attorney paused. "The waitress," Richard added, not with dismissal, not with distance, but with certainty. "Naomi Carter." He spoke her name clearly, as if placing it into something permanent, something that would not be overlooked. "I want her involved, not because she needs it, but because she understands something I lost." The light turned green, the car moved forward again, and Richard felt the weight of the decision settle into place, not heavy, not uncertain, but grounded, because for the first time in years, he was not making a decision to expand his influence. He was making one to redefine it. The attorney exhaled slowly, then replied, "I will begin drafting the revisions," his tone professional, but edged with something else, something like respect, because even he could hear the shift in Richard's voice. And as the call ended, Richard lowered the phone, the city continuing around him, unchanged, indifferent, but inside, something had already been rewritten, not on paper yet, not in legal terms, but in the one place that mattered most before anything else could follow. The next morning arrived without announcement. No dramatic shift in the sky, No signal that anything had changed. But inside a quiet law office on the 32nd floor of a downtown building, something already had. Papers were spread across a wide oak desk, precise, structured, every line drafted with intention, because when men like Richard Holloway rewrote something, it was never casual. It was deliberate, permanent. His attorney adjusted his glasses, reviewing the final language one more time, not for error, but for clarity, because what sat on that desk was not just a legal document. It was a redirection of legacy, and across the city, Naomi Carter moved through her morning like she always did, early light filtering through the small apartment window, the hum of traffic below, the quiet rhythm of routine that did not wait for anyone's transformation. She tied her hair back, checked the time, and stepped into a day that felt no different from the one before, because for her, nothing had changed, not yet, not visibly. The world did not pause to recognize moments of truth. It moved forward, expecting you to keep pace. Back at the office, Richard signed the final page without hesitation, the pen moving smoothly across the paper, his name settling into place with the same confidence it had carried for decades. But this time, the meaning behind it was different, because this signature was not about ownership, not about control. It was about acknowledgement, a quiet admission that something greater than strategy had entered the equation. His attorney gathered the documents carefully, placing them into a folder that would soon become part of something official, something irreversible. It will be filed by the end of the day, he said, his tone steady, professional, but carrying a weight he did not try to hide, and Richard simply nodded. No need for elaboration, because the decision had already moved beyond discussion. It was now action. Hours later, the restaurant prepared for another evening. Tables set, lights dimmed, the same soft music filling the space as if nothing had ever disrupted it. Naomi stepped onto the floor, her uniform crisp, her movements practiced, and for a while, everything was exactly the same. Orders taken, plates delivered, quiet smiles exchanged, until the manager approached her, his expression slightly different than usual, not urgent, not concerned, but uncertain in a way that made her pause. "Naomi," he said, lowering his voice just enough to separate the moment from the rest of the room. "There is someone here to see you." She frowned slightly, not out of fear, but confusion, because people did not come here to see her. They came to be served, not to seek her out. She glanced toward the entrance, expecting nothing, and yet something in the air felt different, not loud, not obvious, just enough to make the moment feel like it was about to shift again, because sometimes the consequences of a single sentence do not arrive immediately. They take their time. They move quietly, building into something you cannot see until it is standing right in front of you. Waiting, Naomi wiped her hands lightly against her apron, her brow tightening just slightly as she stepped away from the table she had been serving. Because nothing about that sentence felt normal. People did not come looking for her. Not here. Not like this. And yet something in the manager's tone told her this was not a mistake. She moved toward the entrance slowly, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the kind that prepares you for moments you cannot yet define. And as she approached, she saw him, not seated, not commanding the room like the night before, but standing near the front, alone, without the weight of an audience. Richard Holloway looked different in that light. Not smaller, not diminished, but quieter, as if something had been set down that he no longer needed to carry. For a brief second, neither of them spoke, because this moment did not belong to the rhythm of the restaurant. It existed outside of it, and Naomi was the first to break the silence, her voice steady, professional, but edged with curiosity. "Sir, is everything all right?" And Richard nodded once, not immediately, stepping forward, not trying to control the space between them. "Yes," he said, his tone measured, but lacking the sharp certainty it once carried. "I just needed to speak with you." And there it was, simple, direct, but different, because men like him did not usually need anything from people like her, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Naomi studied him briefly, not with suspicion, but with awareness, because she understood that moments like this could change direction quickly, and she was not interested in being pulled into something unclear. "I have a few minutes," she replied, her posture still composed, still grounded in her role, but open enough to allow whatever this was to unfold. Richard took a small breath, Not dramatic, not heavy. Just enough to mark the transition from who he had been to what he was about to say. "What you said last night," he began, then paused, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully. "It stayed with me." Naomi did not respond right away. Not because she was surprised, but because she was listening, truly listening, and that changed the weight of everything that followed. "I have spent most of my life believing I understood people," Richard continued, "believing I could measure them, predict them, decide their value based on how they reacted to situations I controlled." He let the words settle before continuing. "But you made me realize something I have been missing for a long time." His gaze held hers now, not with authority, not with expectation, but with something far less familiar to him: honesty. "I was not testing anyone else," he said quietly. "I was revealing myself." The words did not land as an apology, they landed as truth, and that distinction mattered, because Naomi had heard apologies before, quick, convenient, designed to restore comfort. But this was different. This was not about easing a moment. It was about acknowledging one. And for the first time since he walked in, she allowed her posture to soften just slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, because she understood the difference between someone trying to fix a situation and someone trying to understand it. And Richard continued, his voice steady. "I made a decision after I left here," he said. "One that I would not have made without that moment." He did not explain it yet, did not rush into details, because this was not about impressing her. It was about letting the weight of what he had done speak for itself. And Naomi, standing there in the quiet space between service and something more, realized that whatever was coming next, it was not about $5 anymore. It was about something much larger, something neither of them had planned. But both of them had stepped into the moment they chose to speak instead of stay silent. Richard reached into his jacket slowly, not as a gesture of power, not as a performance, but as someone handling something that carried weight beyond the object itself. And when he pulled out the folded document, he did not hand it to her immediately. He held it for a second, as if acknowledging what it represented before letting it leave his hands. "I rewrote my will," he said, his voice steady, but quieter than it had ever been in that room. And Naomi's expression did not change right away, not because she did not understand the words, but because she understood their magnitude. And she was careful with moments that carried that kind of weight. Richard continued, not rushing, not filling the space unnecessarily. "A portion of everything I have built will now go towards something different, something that supports people who are overlooked, people who are never part of the room when decisions are made." He paused, then added with clarity, "And I asked for you to be part of it." The words landed without decoration, without expectation, just truth. And for the first time since this conversation began, Naomi felt something shift inside her. Not disbelief, not excitement, but something deeper, something that required her to fully understand before she responded. "Why me?" she asked, her voice calm, not defensive, not impressed, just direct, because she had learned that clarity mattered more than assumption. Richard did not hesitate. "This time, because you did not try to impress me," he said. "You did not try to win. You did not try to prove anything. You told the truth when there was nothing in it for you." He held her gaze, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement. "And that is something I cannot measure, which means it is something I need to trust." The restaurant moved around them, quiet conversations continuing, glasses clinking softly. But in that space, everything else felt distant. Naomi looked at the document now, but she did not reach for it yet, because this was not about the paper, it was about the meaning behind it. "You understand," she said slowly, "that what you are offering changes more than just numbers." Richard nodded. "I know," he replied. And for once, the certainty in his voice was not about control, it was about acceptance. Naomi took a small breath, then finally reached out, not to take ownership, not to claim anything, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was, a turning point, not just for him, but for something larger than both of them. And as her fingers touched the edge of the document, she looked back at him, her expression steady, grounded in the same quiet strength she had carried from the beginning. "Then I will not be part of it because you chose me," she said, her voice firm, but calm. "I will be part of it because it needs to be done right." Richard gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in respect, because that was the answer he had not known he was waiting for. And in that moment, there was no imbalance, No hierarchy, no test, just two people standing in the space where something had been rewritten, not just on paper, but in the way value was understood, because in the end, he had walked into that room believing he could define worth, but he left understanding something far more difficult. That worth is not assigned, it is revealed, and sometimes it takes the quietest voice in the room to make the loudest change.